The night my parents kicked me out of the house, they were celebrating my brother's success. I still remember the smell of garlic bread in the oven, the clinking of wine glasses, and my mother laughing like something incredible had just happened. To them, it had. My younger brother Daniel had just gotten his first real job, and in their eyes, that meant he had officially become the pride of the family. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the same moment they were throwing me out to make room for him would eventually become the reason I'd end up running the very company he had just joined. But that night, none of that had happened yet. That night, I was just the daughter they didn't want anymore. My name is Alina, and for as long as I can remember, I lived in the shadow of my brother. Daniel was the golden child, the one my parents talked about at every family gathering, the one they bragged about to neighbors and coworkers, the one whose smallest achievements were treated like life-changing events. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one who kept everything together. I was the one who helped Mom cook dinner after work, the one who cleaned the house when things got messy, the one who reminded Daniel about his homework, drove him to soccer practice when Dad was too busy, and stayed up late helping him study before exams. And somehow, I was still the disappointment. Growing up, I learned very quickly that in our house, effort didn't matter, only attention did. If Daniel got a B on a test, my parents would praise him like he had climbed Mount Everest. If I got straight A's, the reaction was usually something like, "Well, that's what we expect from you." No celebration, no excitement, just expectation. By the time I reached college, the pattern was so normal that I barely questioned it anymore. I was 22 years old and in my final semester studying business administration. I had spent the last 4 years juggling classes, scholarships, and part-time jobs because my parents had made it very clear they weren't going to pay for my education. Daniel, on the other hand, had dropped out of community college after his first year. But somehow, none of that mattered. Because one afternoon he came home with news that changed the atmosphere of the entire house. "I got hired," he announced, tossing his backpack onto the couch like it was nothing. Mom rushed out of the kitchen immediately. "Hired where?" "Brightstone Dynamics," he said proudly. The reaction was instant. Mom gasped like he had just told her he'd been accepted to Harvard. Dad stood up from the table and clapped him on the back. "That's a big company," Dad said. Daniel smirked. "Yeah, entry-level tech support. And shikan, anchansa sotsinaid." You would have thought he had just become the CEO. Mom started planning a celebration dinner immediately. Dad called two relatives to tell them the news, and Daniel walked around the house like he had just secured the future of the entire family. Meanwhile, I sat quietly on the couch, finishing an assignment on my laptop. No one asked about my finals. No one asked about the internship applications I had been sending out. That evening, Mom cooked Daniel's favorite pasta and garlic bread. Dad brought out a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. Apparently, this was it. The four of us sat around the dining table while my parents toasted to Daniel's bright future. "To success," Dad said proudly. "To Daniel," Mom added with a huge smile. They both raised their glasses. I raised mine too, even though I felt like an extra at someone else's celebration. Dinner was filled with stories about Daniel's potential. "Antaik sta chin mir and ananshamche, sir." Dad kept talking about how this job was just the beginning, how Daniel would probably rise through the company quickly. Mom kept asking questions about his co-workers and his manager like he was already an executive. Daniel soaked up the attention like sunlight. At some point during dessert, Dad leaned back in his chair and sighed happily. "Well," he said, "now that Daniel has a stable job, we need to start thinking about the future." Mom nodded immediately. "Yes, we should make some adjustments around the house." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. I looked up from my plate. "What kind of adjustments?" Dad looked directly at me. "We think it's time for you to move out." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. "Move out?" I repeated slowly. Mom spoke like this was the most logical thing in the world. "You're an adult now, Alina. And Daniel needs the extra room." "The extra room for what?" I asked, confused. Daniel answered before my parents could. "For a home office," he said casually. I stared at him. You just got an entry-level job. He shrugged. Still, I waited for someone to laugh. For someone to admit this was a joke. But no one did. Dad folded his hands on the table. You've been living here rent-free for years. I'm in college, I said quietly. You're finishing college, Mom corrected. Which means it's time to start standing on your own 2 feet. The conversation felt unreal. I had spent years helping run that household. Cooking meals, cleaning, helping Daniel with school, taking care of responsibilities my parents didn't want to deal with. And suddenly, I was the one who didn't belong there. How long do I have? I asked. Dad didn't hesitate. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The words echoed in my head like a door slamming shut. I turned to Daniel, hoping for even the smallest hint of guilt. Seriously? I asked him. He avoided my eyes. It's not personal, he said. I just need the space. Not personal. I nodded slowly. At that moment, something inside me shifted. For years, I had tried to earn my place in that house, tried to prove that I was useful, responsible, worthy of being treated like part of the family. But sitting there at that dinner table, I realized something painful. I had never actually been part of the family they cared about. I was just the one who kept things running in the background, the invisible glue. And once they thought they didn't need me anymore, they threw me away. That night, after everyone went to bed, I packed my things quietly. Clothes, my laptop, a few books. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases and a backpack. Before leaving, I stood in the living room for a moment, looking around the house where I had grown up. Not one person woke up to stop me. Not one person asked me to stay. So I picked up my bags, walked out the front door, and closed it behind me. At the time, it felt like the worst moment of my life. But what my parents didn't realize was that kicking me out that night would change everything, because the company my brother was so proud to join was about to become the place where I built my entire future. The first night after my parents kicked me out, I learned something about silence, not the peaceful kind you experience in a quiet room, the heavy kind. The kind that sits in your chest and makes you realize that everything familiar in your life is suddenly gone. I slept in my car that night. My old Honda was parked under a dim streetlight in the corner of a grocery store parking lot. The seats were stiff, the air was cold, and every sound outside made me sit up and check the doors again. I had never felt so alone in my life, but strangely, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. The words my parents had said at dinner replayed in my mind over and over again like a broken recording. You have 2 weeks. Except I hadn't even taken 2 weeks. I left the same night. For years, I had tried to be the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who helped, who stayed quiet, who made life easier for everyone else. And it still hadn't been enough. Lying there in the driver's seat, staring at the dark windshield, I realized something that changed the way I looked at everything. If I was going to struggle anyway, I might as well struggle for myself. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My neck hurt from sleeping in an awkward position, and my back felt like it had been folded in half all night. But I forced myself to sit up, splash some water on my face using a bottle I kept in the car, and drive straight to campus. If I stopped moving, I knew the emotions would catch up with me, and I couldn't afford that. My university library opened at 7 in the morning. I was already waiting outside when the doors unlocked. Inside, the warmth felt almost unreal. I found a quiet table in the corner and opened my laptop. My bank account had just over $1,200 in it. My final semester tuition payment was due soon. Rent somewhere, even a small room, would wipe out most of my savings. Panic tried to creep in. I pushed it away. Instead of thinking about everything that could go wrong, I focused on the only thing that mattered, finding a way forward. For the next several hours, I searched for everything: internships, graduate programs, scholarships, part-time jobs, management trainee programs. I applied to anything that even remotely matched my degree. Some applications took 5 minutes, others took an hour. Cover letters, resume, online tests. I submitted dozens. Around midday, I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my tired eyes. That's when one listing caught my attention. Brightstone Dynamics. The name made my stomach tighten immediately. It was the same company Daniel had been celebrating just 2 nights earlier. But this posting was different from his entry-level support job. It was for something called a management development program. According to the description, Brightstone was looking for top business graduates to train for leadership roles inside the company. The program rotated candidates through different departments, exposing them to strategy, operations, and executive decision-making. The acceptance rate was less than 3%. I stared at the screen for a long time. Daniel had gotten his job because Dad's friend knew someone in the company. Connections. I didn't have any of those. What I did have were things that no one had ever really cared about before. My grades. My work ethic. My determination to never depend on my parents again. Slowly, I clicked the application link. The process was intense. It asked for transcripts, references, a personal statement, and a recorded video interview explaining why I wanted to join the program. I almost laughed at that question. Why did I want to join? Because I needed a future. Because I refused to go back to the life I had just walked away from. Because I wanted to prove, if only to myself, that I was capable of more than being the invisible daughter in someone else's house. It took nearly 2 hours to complete the entire application. When I finally hit submit, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Realistically, the chances of hearing back were tiny. Hundreds, maybe thousands of students would apply. Many of them probably had connections, recommendations, and impressive family backgrounds. I had none of those things. So I closed my laptop and moved on. The next few weeks became a blur of survival. A close friend from university, Maya, let me sleep on her couch temporarily. Her apartment was tiny, and I tried not to take up too much space. During the day, I attended classes and finished my final projects. At night, I worked long shifts at a cafe near campus. It wasn't glamorous work. I cleaned tables, made coffee, and dealt with impatient customers who snapped their fingers when they wanted service faster. But every paycheck mattered. Some nights I returned to Maya's apartment so exhausted that I fell asleep without even changing clothes. Other nights I stayed up late studying for exams. There was no safety net anymore. If I failed, there would be no parents to fall back on. But strangely, that pressure made me stronger. For the first time in my life, every step I took was my own choice. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after submitting the Brightstone application, I was standing behind the cafe counter, wiping down the espresso machine when my phone buzzed. Normally, I ignored notifications during work, but something about the subject line made my heart jump. Brightstone Dynamics. My first thought was that it had to be a rejection email. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it quickly, almost ripping the screen with my finger. The message was short. Dear Alina, we are pleased to invite you to the first stage of interviews for the Brightstone Dynamics Management Development Program. I read the sentence 3 times before it finally registered. Interview. Not rejection. An interview. My hands started shaking slightly. Around me, the cafe continued as usual. Customers chatted. Coffee machines hissed. Someone laughed at a table near the window. But for a moment, it felt like the entire world had paused. Because for the first time since leaving my parents' house, something good had happened. The interview process was brutal. The first round was a virtual assessment filled with problem-solving challenges and business case questions. The second round involved a panel of managers asking rapid-fire questions about leadership, conflict resolution, and strategic thinking. The third round was the most intimidating of all. I had to present a business improvement proposal to a group of executives. I spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for it. When the presentation ended, the room stayed silent for several seconds. Then one of the executives smiled slightly. That small smile stayed in my mind for days. A week later, another email arrived. This time I opened it sitting on Maya's couch. Congratulations. You have been selected to join the Brightstone Dynamics Management Development Program. Out of more than 800 applicants, only 12 had been chosen. And somehow, I was one of them. That was the moment my life truly began to change. Because while my brother had entered Brightstone Dynamics through a connection, I had entered through something far more powerful: my own determination. And neither my parents nor Daniel had the slightest idea what was coming next. For most of my life, I had been invisible. The quiet daughter, the responsible one, the one who handled problems while everyone else received the praise. Even when I started working at Brightstone Dynamics, I carried that same mindset with me. I kept my head down, worked harder than everyone else, and assumed that if I did enough, eventually someone would notice. I didn't realize just how much they had noticed until the day the board called me into their office. But getting there didn't happen overnight. The management development program at Brightstone Dynamics was nothing like I expected. The first week alone felt like a test designed to break people. We started every morning at 7. Strategy sessions, operational simulations, department rotations, leadership assessments, every hour was scheduled. By the time the workday officially ended, most of us stayed another 3 or 4 hours just trying to keep up with the assignments. 12 of us had been selected from hundreds of applicants. By the end of the first year, only 8 remained. Some people left because the pressure was too much. Others were quietly removed from the program after failing performance evaluations. But every time I felt overwhelmed, I remembered the night I slept in my car. Compared to that, nothing in an office could scare me. I pushed myself harder than anyone else. While others went home after long days, I stayed to review reports, learn company systems, and ask managers questions about decisions they had made. At first, some executives seemed surprised by my curiosity, but over time, they started answering more openly. 2 years into the program, I was promoted to project manager. It was my first real leadership position. I was responsible for overseeing a small team tasked with improving operational efficiency in one of Brightstone's logistics departments. Most new managers tried to play it safe, sticking closely to existing systems. I did the opposite. After analyzing months of data, I proposed a restructuring plan that would streamline several outdated processes. The plan carried risk. If it failed, it could slow production. But if it worked, the company would save millions. For several days, I waited nervously for the executive team to respond. Then the approval came through. 3 months later, the results were clear. Productivity increased by nearly 30%, and operational costs dropped significantly. That was the first time my name started circulating beyond my department. Over the next few years, opportunities kept appearing. Each time, I said yes, even when the challenge felt intimidating. I led product development teams, coordinated international partnerships, and eventually took over an entire division focused on emerging technology services. By the time I turned 30, I was running one of the fastest growing divisions in the entire company. Meanwhile, life outside the office remained strangely quiet. I never returned to my parents' house after the night they kicked me out. Occasionally, I heard updates through distant relatives or social media posts. Daniel still worked at Brightstone Dynamics. He had been there almost as long as I had. But his career hadn't followed the same trajectory. From what little I heard, he stayed in the same support department for years, often complaining about managers who didn't recognize his talent. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't think much about him anymore. Brightstone had become my world. Then one morning, everything shifted. The company's longtime CEO announced his retirement. The news spread through the building like electricity. For decades, he had been the face of Brightstone. Most employees couldn't imagine the company without him. The board immediately began discussing potential successors. Rumors started circulating within weeks. Some people believed the role would go to the chief financial officer. Others thought an external executive might be brought in to lead the company through its next phase of growth. I didn't consider the possibility that my name might be on that list. Not until the day I received an unexpected email from the chairman of the board. He requested a private meeting. At first, I assumed it was about my division's recent expansion plans. But when I walked into the boardroom, I immediately sensed something different. Several board members were already seated at the table. The chairman greeted me with a warm smile and gestured for me to sit down. "Alina," he began, folding his hands together, "we've been reviewing the company's leadership pipeline." I nodded politely, unsure where the conversation was going. He continued, Over the past 5 years, your division has consistently produced the highest growth numbers in the organization. Another board member spoke next. Your strategic proposals have also played a major role in several of the company's most successful expansions. I listened carefully, still confused about the purpose of the meeting. Then the chairman said the words that made my heart skip a beat. We'd like you to be considered for the CEO position. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. Me? I asked quietly. He nodded. This company is entering a new phase. We need someone who understands both the operational side and the long-term strategic vision. Your record speaks for itself. The room fell silent as I processed what he had said. Becoming CEO wasn't just a promotion. It meant leading a company with thousands of employees and billions in revenue. It meant making decisions that could shape entire industries. And somehow, they believed I could do it. The evaluation process lasted several months. I participated in strategic reviews, presented long-term growth plans, and answered difficult questions about leadership philosophy and risk management. Every meeting felt like an exam. Some nights I returned home completely exhausted, wondering if I had said the wrong thing or made a weak argument. But the more discussions I had with the board, the more confident I became. Because everything they asked about, the company's culture, its operations, its future direction, were things I had spent years thinking about. Finally, one Friday morning, I received another request to meet with the chairman. This time, when I entered his office, he stood up and walked toward me with a smile. "Congratulations, Alina," he said. Two simple words, but they carried the weight of everything I had worked for. You're officially the next CEO of Brightstone Dynamics. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Images flashed through my mind. Sleeping in my car, studying late nights in the library, working double shifts at the cafe. All of it had somehow led to this moment. After the meeting ended, I walked through the office halls in a strange state of disbelief. Soon, the company would make a public announcement. Thousands of employees would learn who their new leader was. And somewhere inside this same building, my brother Daniel was still working in the support department. He had no idea what was about to happen. The following Monday, Brightstone scheduled a company-wide town hall meeting in the main auditorium. Every department was invited. Executives filled the front rows while employees packed the rest of the room. The atmosphere buzzed with speculation. When the chairman stepped onto the stage, the room gradually quieted. He spoke briefly about the company's history and its future direction. Then he reached the moment everyone was waiting for. "It is my honor," he said, "to introduce the next CEO of Brightstone Dynamics." He paused. "Alina Carter." The room exploded into applause as I walked onto the stage. But as I scanned the crowd, my eyes eventually landed on a familiar face sitting several rows back. Daniel. At first he looked confused. Then his eyes widened. And in that exact moment, he realized that the sister our parents had thrown out years ago was now the person running his company. The strangest part about becoming CEO wasn't the responsibility, the media attention, or even the sudden change in how people treated me. It was the silence from my family. For years, they had barely acknowledged my existence. Birthdays passed without calls. Holidays came and went without invitations. I had slowly accepted that whatever relationship we once had was gone. So when Brightstone Dynamics officially announced me as the new CEO, part of me wondered if they would even notice. It took exactly 2 days. I was sitting in my office early Wednesday morning, reviewing a stack of reports when my phone lit up on the desk. I glanced at the screen absent-mindedly, expecting it to be one of my managers. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. Mom. My hand hovered over the phone for several seconds. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind at once. Memories of that dinner table. The moment they told me I had 2 weeks to leave. The night I packed my bags while the rest of the house slept. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up. "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end, like she hadn't expected me to answer. Then her voice came through, overly cheerful. "Alina? Sweetheart. Sweetheart." The word sounded strange coming from her mouth after all these years. "We just heard the most amazing news." she continued excitedly. I leaned back in my chair, listening quietly. You're the CEO of Brightstone Dynamics. Can you believe it? We're so proud of you. Proud. The word echoed in my head like a joke. Before I could respond, I heard another voice in the background. Dad. He took the phone almost immediately. Alina, this is incredible, he said enthusiastically. We always knew you were capable of great things. I stared out the large window behind my desk, watching people move along the busy street below. Always knew. That wasn't how I remembered it. Not when they refused to help with my tuition. Not when they pushed me out of the house to make room for Daniel's imaginary home office. But I stayed calm. Thank you, I said simply. Then Mom jumped back into the conversation. Daniel told us you're technically his boss now. What a funny coincidence. Coincidence. Like my entire career had just been some random twist of fate. I let the comment pass. There was a brief silence before Mom said the thing I knew was coming. We should get together, she said brightly. It's been far too long since we've seen you. Maybe you could come over for dinner this weekend. There it was. The sudden desire to reconnect. 8 years of distance erased the moment a title appeared next to my name. Part of me wanted to say no immediately, but another part of me felt something else. Curiosity. I wanted to see them again, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted to understand how they would act now. So I agreed. Saturday evening, I pulled into the same driveway I had walked away from years earlier. The house looked almost exactly the same. Same front porch. Same flower beds my mother used to take care of every spring. Same old mailbox leaning slightly to the left. For a moment, I just sat in the car remembering the girl who used to live there. She had spent years trying to earn love from people who barely noticed her. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and walked to the front door. Mom opened it before I even had a chance to knock. Alina, she said warmly, pulling me into a quick hug that felt more awkward than affectionate. Dad appeared behind her with a wide smile. Look at you, he said proudly. Our CEO. Our CEO. The phrase made something in my chest tighten. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken and fresh bread. Dinner was already prepared. We sat at the same dining table where the conversation 8 years earlier had changed my life. For the first few minutes, everything felt strangely normal. Mom asked polite questions about the company. Dad talked about how impressive Brightstone's growth had been over the years. But something felt rehearsed, like they were trying very hard to pretend the past had never happened. Then I noticed something new on the wall, a framed newspaper article. The headline read, Brightstone Dynamics names new CEO, and beneath it was my photo. Seeing it there, inside the same house where I had once been treated like a burden, felt surreal. Daniel arrived a few minutes later. He walked into the dining room slowly, his expression stiff. He barely looked at me. Hey, he muttered before sitting down. Dinner began. Dad filled the silence by talking about how successful our family had become. Mom kept asking questions about company events and executive meetings, but eventually, the real reason for the invitation started to surface. So, Mom said casually, Daniel mentioned you're his CEO now. I nodded. That must be such an interesting situation, she continued. Family working together like that. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad leaned forward slightly. Maybe you could help him move up in the company, he suggested. Put in a good word with the right people. There it was. The real reason for the dinner. Not reconnection. Opportunity. I set my fork down calmly. Daniel's career will be evaluated the same way as everyone else's, I said. Mom frowned slightly. Well, of course, she said quickly. But a little support from the top never hurts. Daniel had been silent up to that point, but suddenly he slammed his fork down on the table. You're not seriously acting like she earned this, are you? He snapped. The room froze. Mom looked shocked. Daniel, but he kept going. You probably just got lucky, he said, staring directly at me. These companies always pick people for weird reasons. For a moment, the old version of me almost responded, the quiet girl who avoided conflict. The one who kept the peace even when it meant staying silent. But that girl didn't exist anymore. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him calmly. Daniel, I said gently, I've worked at Brightstone for 8 years. He shrugged dismissively. So? You've been there 9. He frowned, confused. So what's your point? I smiled slightly. If luck was the only reason someone becomes CEO, I said calmly, you'd be sitting in my seat. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Dad cleared his throat quickly and changed the subject. But the damage had already been done. For the first time in my life, I had said exactly what needed to be said, and no one at that table had a response. The dinner with my parents ended quietly. There was no dramatic shouting, no slammed doors, no emotional confrontation like the ones you see in movies. Instead, the evening faded into an awkward silence that lingered long after the dishes were cleared. After my comment to Daniel, no one really knew what to say. Dad tried to steer the conversation back to safe topics: weather, business news, anything that didn't involve the tension sitting between us at the table. Mom forced a few polite smiles, but I could see the discomfort in her eyes. Daniel barely spoke for the rest of the night. When dinner ended, I thanked them for the meal and stood up to leave. Mom walked me to the door. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something important. Maybe an apology. Maybe an explanation for everything that had happened years ago. But the words never came. Instead, she just said, "You should visit more often." I nodded politely. "Take care," I replied. Then I stepped outside, walked to my car, and drove away. As I pulled out of the driveway, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel angry. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to face them again after proving them wrong. I thought maybe I would feel satisfaction or some kind of dramatic sense of victory. But what I actually felt was something much quieter: peace. Because that dinner confirmed something I had slowly been learning over the years. Some people don't change. They simply adjust their behavior when circumstances change. The parents who had once dismissed my dreams were now proud of my title. The brother who once ignored me now felt threatened by my position. But none of them had truly understood the journey that got me there. And that realization made something very clear. I didn't need their validation anymore. Life at Brightstone Dynamics moved quickly after that. Becoming CEO meant stepping into a role that affected thousands of employees, investors, and clients across multiple countries. My days started early and often ended long after the sun went down. Board meetings, strategic planning sessions, global partnerships, every decision carried weight. But strangely, I loved the challenge. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove my worth to anyone else. I was simply doing work that mattered. Over the next year, the company grew faster than anyone expected. We expanded into new international markets, launched innovative technology divisions, and built partnerships that strengthened our position in the industry. Employees across the company brought new ideas and energy to their work. One of my biggest priorities as CEO was building a culture where people felt recognized for their contributions, something I had rarely experienced growing up. Hard work deserved acknowledgement. Talent deserved opportunity. And everyone deserved to feel like their efforts mattered. Daniel continued working at Brightstone during that time. As CEO, I technically had the authority to influence his career. I could have promoted him. I could have transferred him to another department. I could have made his life at the company either easier or more difficult. But I chose not to do any of those things. From the very beginning, I made a simple decision. Daniel would be treated exactly like every other employee. No favoritism. No punishment. Just fairness. I never called him into my office. I never discussed his performance with his managers. As far as company leadership was concerned, he was simply another name in the employee database. At first, that seemed to frustrate him. According to department reports, he occasionally complained about the situation to coworkers. Some people expected that having a CEO in the family would give him special advantages. When those advantages never appeared, he grew increasingly bitter. But fairness meant treating everyone the same, even when that included family. About a year after I became CEO, I received a short notification from Human Resources. Daniel had submitted his resignation. He had accepted a job at another company. The message didn't include any personal note from him, just the standard exit paperwork that HR processed for departing employees every day. When I read the email, I paused for a moment. Part of me wondered if he had left because of pride. Maybe it was uncomfortable working in a company where his older sister had become the leader. Or maybe he simply wanted a fresh start somewhere else. Either way, I didn't contact him. Some relationships fade naturally when people choose different paths, and sometimes that distance is healthier than forcing connections that no longer exist. Years passed. Brightstone continued to grow and evolve, and my role as CEO became less surprising to people who had once doubted it. New employees joined the company without ever knowing the story of the girl who once slept in her car while applying for the job that started it all. But every once in a while, I would think back to that night. The night my parents told me I had 2 weeks to leave. The night I packed my bags while the rest of the house slept. At the time, it had felt like rejection. Like the worst thing that could possibly happen. But looking back, I could see it differently. That moment had forced me to stand on my own. It had pushed me into a world where my success depended entirely on my own choices, my own determination, and my own resilience. Without that push, I might have stayed in the same house for years, quietly supporting everyone else while my own dreams waited in the background. Sometimes the moments that break your heart are the ones that open the door to your future. People often ask me what motivated me during the hardest years of my life. They expect some dramatic answer: revenge, anger, the desire to prove someone wrong. But the truth is much simpler. I didn't build my life trying to prove my parents wrong. I built it trying to prove something to myself: that I was capable, that I deserved success. That being underestimated didn't define my limits. In fact, being underestimated can become one of the most powerful advantages a person has. Because when no one expects you to succeed, you are free to grow without their expectations holding you back. The girl my parents once asked to leave their house eventually built a life far beyond anything they had imagined. Not because she was lucky, not because someone handed her an opportunity, but because she refused to let someone else's opinion decide who she could become. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of justice life can offer.